And I'm here with you for HIT 445 Quality Management. We are finishing up week 3. This is on chapter 13 and it is managing the environment of care. So if you want to turn in your book, I'm on page 233. The objectives for this chapter are here, looking at the organization's environment of care. So we'll be talking about NIMS, the National Incident Management System, the EC standards from Joint Commission, emergency operations plans, risk assessments, hazard vulnerability analysis processes, and safety monitoring. So let's talk about the environment of care. That's pretty much buildings, facilities, maintenance, housekeeping, all those types of things. You have to have a safety management program. This is a plan for the environment of care. It involves master planning. It outlines the design of the safety functions for the organization. It looks at all of your facilities if you have any construction projects going on. It looks at fire extinguishers. It looks at stairwells. It looks at signage. It looks at cleanliness. It looks at maintenance, lighting, security, all those types of things. Life safety really looks at more fire safety, and I'm not sure we're going to cover that here. Does it say that we're going to cover life safety? I don't think it does. So I'm going to leave that alone for a minute until we get further in. Then you want to make sure your security management is part of this. How do you make sure that your grounds, your buildings, your specific areas within the organization are secure? So you have risk assessments that you do on an annual basis. You have procedures about managing door access, when do door codes change, who has access to door codes, how are they changed, how is the code disseminated, what happens when you let someone go. It can involve visiting hours and after hours access on weekends or holidays. It looks at parking areas, employee identification badges, keys, all those types of things. Sensitive areas like the ED, the OR, the nursery, the newborn nursery, all of those are sensitive areas. Workplace violence, human resource areas, administration, HIM, because sometimes we can get some violence going too, unfortunately, with people who are unhappy with us when we won't release information inappropriately. Also workplace violence in places like the ED, or if you have a situation where someone has a domestic violence situation in their home and their ex is coming after them, or maybe they've got a restraining order. You know, how do you handle all of those things? How are you proactive? What happens if something goes wrong? Then you've got improving hazardous materials waste management. This is all those things that involve hazardous materials. Orienting employees, I used to say, you don't sniff the whiteout, you don't lick the toner. Basically you identify what are the hazardous materials in your area. How do you handle those? How do you store them, transport them, use them, and dispose of them? Most of it's common sense in areas, but then you get to lab and you get to pharmacy. You get to other areas that are actually handling hazardous materials on a regular basis. And they need very specific instructions and protective gear and things like that. You need to maintain your organization's inventory of hazardous materials and waste used or generated by that organization. You need to manage your chemical therapy, therapeutic, radioactive. You think about radiation therapy or diagnostic radiation if you have a nuclear med department, body fluids, infectious waste, handling sharps, all of that comes under hazardous materials and waste management. Making sure that you're disposing of hazardous gas and vapors appropriately, and again, the protective equipment so that people can handle these things as they need to. Reporting and investigating all hazardous material waste or waste spills, exposure, or other instances have to be done. And you have to make sure that you provide safety data sheets. It used to be called material safety data sheets. Now they're just SDS safety data sheets. These are documents that give detailed information about a material, including any associated hazards. And you have to have those readily available to everyone in the organization. Most of the time, most healthcare organizations have an intranet, and they have it posted there so that you can go click on it and find what you need to find. Then you have to have an emergency operations plan. You need to know what's going to happen in case of an internal or an external disaster or some other kind of emergency. How are you going to handle a huge influx of patients? What are you going to do in an active shooter situation? What are you going to do in a child abduction or an infant abduction situation? What are you going to do if you have a tornado hit? Here in Iowa, we had the derecho storms. No one could have predicted that they would do the damage that they did. Well, emergency operations plans need to take that kind of weather-related activity into mind when they're developing their emergency operations plan. What happens if you lose your electricity for 5 days? What happens if you lose your EHR system because of no internet or no wireless or no broadband or what have you for 5 days? All these things. So you do a hazard vulnerability analysis. What is most likely to happen to you? For us here, we're not near a coast, so we aren't going to have a hurricane, but we did have the derecho storms. Tornadoes are a possibility for us. Earthquakes, probably not so much. If we were in California, we definitely want to have earthquakes as part of our emergency operations plan. So you have those types of things to consider. Mitigation is whatever you're doing that actually eliminates or reduces the occurrence of a disaster, including long-term activities that reduce the effects of unavoidable disasters. So that's what you're doing when you're mitigating. You're trying to prevent in advance, or if it happens, you're trying to get the damage to be as minimal as possible and resolved as quickly as possible. Preparedness is what you're doing when you can't do mitigation. When mitigation won't prevent it, then you want to do preparedness. So preparedness is in advance. Mitigation is while it's happening or afterwards. Response, this is designed to provide emergency assistance for casualties. What happens if you have someone come in and they start shooting up your facility? They come into your ED, and whatever reason they get in and they start shooting. How are you going to handle that? What happens when you do have casualties? Or what happens if you have a factory in your area and they have casualties, they have some kind of accident, and suddenly you're dealing with 20, 30, 40, 50 bodies at a time? How are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle the traffic to your facility? How are you going to handle the family members, the media, all these types of things that suddenly you've got happening? And then recovery, that continues until all systems return to normal or better. Short-term recovery returns vital life support systems to a minimum operating standard. Long-term recovery, maybe a couple of years. Good example here are generators. Hospitals are required to have at least 2 or 3 generators so that they have backup systems. And on a regular basis, they have to shut down their main sources of power and flip on these generators and make sure they are fully functional and ready to go and that they work, and they leave them on 3 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever their requirement is, so that they can prove that they are ready for a disaster. Monitoring and improving the life safety management program. I talked about life safety. I wasn't sure it was here. Now it is. It's fire prevention. I'm going to stop here for a moment. Hospitals, healthcare organizations have very stringent rules, not just local fire department, not just state, but federal. And where this came about is there was a fire in a hospital, and I want to say it was in Baltimore, maybe in the 1950s, and it was devastating. I watched a video that they made probably 40 years after the fact, and they interviewed people who had been involved, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. And I will be honest, I had nightmares for months afterwards, so I'd never recommend people watching it. But what it really did bring home was there was a time when hospitals did not have life safety management programs, where they did not have fire prevention. And all of these stringent rules came into being after that fire at that hospital in Baltimore. And I'm thankful that they did. And where this touched me as an individual is I worked in a large health system that was multi-hospital, and I was responsible for HIM across all of these hospitals. And I had a manager who was working for me out at one of my sites, and it was at a brand new hospital that had been newly built. I've been through that process a number of times in my career, which has been a tremendous blessing. But this individual manager, the HIM department was located in the administrative corridor, and she was offended by the simplicity of the bathroom in the administrative corridor. And she said to me, I really think it needs wallpaper, at least a wallpaper border. It's just too plain. And I remember saying to her, yes, but that's not your decision to make. It's the organizations, and they have to make sure that whatever they do meets code. You can't just come into a hospital and bring any old thing in. This is why they have rules against space heaters. This is why they have rules about toasters. This is why they have rules about different pieces of equipment. We don't understand it, but they have rules about what kinds of things you can bring in because of fire prevention. The items that they purchase for a hospital have to meet certain criteria for fire prevention. And we had that conversation, and unfortunately, she subsequently did something that required termination. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, it wasn't a very big deal. I mean, it wasn't a very big deal in the sense of wallpaper border in a bathroom. But it was a huge deal when you think about bringing in something that could be flammable into a hospital environment. Then it is serious. And years later, when I saw that movie, or not movie, it was a documentary, because they actually interviewed the doctors and nurses that had survived it and experienced it, and they showed photos of what the units looked like after the fire as well as before the fire, because they had photographs. And they had old news clips and other things, and I realized this really is this serious. People don't understand it in the hospital setting. They'll laugh at it, they'll poke fun at the fact that every month somebody from maintenance comes by and checks the fire extinguishers. But I can tell you, if you ever have a real fire in your organization, you will be so very thankful for the sprinklers, for the sprinkler heads, for the people who come around and check those, for the non-flammable materials that they use, whether that's paint or carpeting, and all of those finishes. So enough about that, but you definitely want to make sure you're inspecting, testing, maintaining fire detection and protective equipment, including fire extinguishers and sprinklers and sprinkler heads, and making sure that there's no obstacles to getting down stairwells, all those types of things. You've got to report and investigate fire protection deficiencies, failures, user errors, evaluate proposed acquisition of bedding, window coverings, furnishings, room decorations, waste baskets, and equipment in the context of fire safety. Develop and implement a fire response plan, and you test it. You test. Staff are trained in two mnemonics. One is RACE, and this basically means that you rescue anyone who's close to the fire. You then alert, whether you call that or have someone call that. You contain it by closing doors, and then you extinguish. You get that fire extinguisher out and you use it. Pass means you pull the pin, you aim the fire extinguisher, and you squeeze the handle while you sweep slowly back and forth. So that's why you need to know RACE and PASS. RACE is rescue, alarm, contain, extinguish. PASS is pull, aim, squeeze, sweep. Fire drills have to be conducted every single shift, different days of the week, and different areas. And they actually come up and test different departments. Okay, if we pulled the fire alarm, and there's a fire right here in this spot right here, what are you going to do? They oversee safety of construction and remodeling activities, and infection control is actually involved in that as well. And then they do life safety assessments of different areas. So monitoring and improving medical equipment management, that's another part where you've got people that are checking the medical equipment, making sure it works, that it's not functioning improperly, giving improper results, or that it's just stopped working. They are involved with selecting and acquiring equipment, identifying processes to respond to equipment malfunction or failure. You know, how quickly can they swap out an IV machine? Or if you have a bed that's not working, how quickly can they get you a new bed so you can swap that out and they can fix the other one? And then develop an inventory of clinical, life safety, and security alarms to be evaluated for frequency of inspection, testing, and maintenance. You actually have to provide records showing that you've done all this testing. And then maintain appropriate procedures for monitoring equipment functioning, providing maintenance strategies whenever necessary, tracking systems for all occurrences associated with each piece of equipment that resulted in increased exposure to risk of injury to patients or personnel. And then you get into utilities management. I talked about the generators. Well, it's not just electrical, it's water and testing your well and testing your water from the city and all those types of things. Making sure you've got appropriate water storage on site in case for some reason you can't get water in. Employees have to be prepared to perform appropriate procedures to manage disruptions in each type of service and its effect on patient services. And then you need infection control involved and facility surveillance process coordination. Annual evaluation, you look at objectives, you look at scope, and then performance and effectiveness of the individual programs, because things do change within the organization and you want to make sure that everything is relevant, it stays relevant. So for instance, in 2020, people may not have had a COVID pandemic or an infectious disease pandemic or a viral disease pandemic as part of their plan. But now you can be sure moving into 2021 they do, because that was a huge change that happened. What happens when you can't have patients come into the hospital and you still need to provide care? Then you've got your toolbox technique here. And let's take a look at this. On page, they give you lots of examples of forms, I notice, which is not a bad thing. It is on the bottom of page 267. It's a post-program assessment. You give it to employees after each instance of environment and safety training or at safety fairs. And you want to evaluate the knowledge, making sure that they understand that there's no gaps. And that is it for chapter 13. Okay, so that would be it for week 3. This is the final video. I'll be back to talk to you in week 4, and we will be on, we'll go back for chapter 15, and then we'll pick up chapters 17 and 18. So yes, week 4, 15, 17, 18, but have a great week 3. All right.